Johnathan will tell you a little bit about his background of doing some of the SCADA engineering and now actually going out and actually talking and presenting on this topic. So without further ado, Johnathan?
Hey, thanks. Okay, so as a quick background, I started as a SCADA engineer for Chevron back in the 90s. So I was programming a lot of these SCADA systems back then, and then switched over to the cybersecurity side. And since 2001, we've been involved in doing security assessments and rolling out mitigation strategies for SCADA systems. So this is our core capabilities and core services. And we speak about probably 15 to 20 times a year, usually at SCADA conferences, about cybersecurity. So we thought this year it'd be good to talk about SCADA at a cybersecurity conference. And as we walk through here, the next hour of your life, what we want to do is basically, first of all, just define the electric grid and how it works, from power generation to power transmission to power distribution to the home, so that everyone gets on the same page and understands what we're talking about as far as the topic. Then we're going to talk about our assessment approach that we use to conduct security assessments of this infrastructure. We've done about 120 security assessments over the past 9 years, and of those, probably half were done in the electric sector. And then lastly, we're going to actually go through a database of vulnerabilities that we have collected over the last 9 years and kind of mine that information for trends. So these are a couple of quotes you guys probably have seen in the media. Cybersecurity is a big deal, and it's even a bigger deal for SCADA systems because it controls critical infrastructure. And what we found and what you'll see through this presentation is that SCADA systems are far less secure than enterprise IT systems. And it used to be back in the 90s when these systems ran on serial protocols, 9600 baud. It wasn't on Ethernet. A lot of the systems weren't connected to Ethernet systems, that you could hide behind obscurity, right? You can say, well, this protocol is not really known by a lot of people. This system is proprietary to a specific vendor. In fact, I can remember working with a lot of the different vendors, and each vendor had their own color coding system. So, for instance, if you worked with a Siemens system, you had to buy everything from Siemens, their software package, their cables, you had to use their Profibus protocol. Everything was down the line with that vendor. And what happened in the late 90s, early 2000 years, a lot of the asset owners said, you know, I have a lot of different infrastructure. I have Siemens, I have Yokogawa, Honeywell, Invensys, and they all have to work together. So they pushed for open standards, TCP/IP, leveraging Microsoft-based systems, and so that's kind of how we got to the point we are today. So nowadays, you know, all you have to do is really just open up a Google search engine and just start typing in stuff about SCADA, and you'll find it. Just do your own homework. You'll find that on the first page of hits, you can download the whole Modbus protocol specification. You can download fuzzing hacking tools. And actually, hacking and fuzzing SCADA is pretty simplistic. A lot of the protocols are in the clear, so you don't really have to even decrypt what you're looking at. And as recently as this month, we saw the first introduction of malware that was actually written to exploit SCADA specifically. We've had in the past malware such as like the SQL Slammer worm that was written not to impact SCADA systems. It was written for SQL Server. However, it did impact a lot of SCADA systems back in 2004 because a lot of SCADA systems use SQL Server as part of their components. But this was really the first time we actually saw a targeted attack towards SCADA. And also, if you remember that little advanced persistent threat problem that we're starting to see on the corporate side, guess what? It's also creeping down into the SCADA side. So we've had some customers call us and say, someone is moving this mouse on our screens and we don't know who it is. And that's pretty scary. So what we want to do is first talk about, are we winning the cyber war? It's hard to when we're asleep. When we go through these slides, you guys are probably going to chuckle because I think that hopefully this is a wake-up call for those of us that work in the security profession, especially those that work in critical infrastructure roles, especially with important stuff. So we just really step up. It's time for us to step up the game for sure. So first of all, let's learn how this stuff works. So what we do is we took the electric utility vertical And we're going to break down power generation, power transmission, power distribution. And again, a little disclaimer, the diagrams that we're using here, this is not any particular diagrams from any particular system. I generated these diagrams myself based on what a typical power generation, transmission, and distribution system looks like. This actually came right off the NERC website. So power is generated, then transmitted, and then distributed to the home. And I want to break down each one for you. And all of these diagrams, all of this stuff is in the white paper as well as the slides that's in your CD. So if you look at a typical power generation system, this is where your first line of defense is, the internet firewall. And then there's typical corporate systems that you would find just like any other IT system on the corporate side. And then there's master DCS firewalls, which DCS is distributed control systems. And the DCS firewall is then the second tier of defense when you get down into the SCADA systems that manage the generation of power. And then down in the DCS system is where you have industrial switches. These are not typically by Cisco or Juniper. This is typically by Garrettcom, RuggedCom, other vendors that actually specialize in developing ruggedized industrial switches. And then those switches connect all of the various distributed control components together over TCP/IP. So when you break this down, your first choke point is the internet choke point. And when typically we've been hired to conduct penetration testing, we find that the internet firewall is pretty well hardened. A lot of the security professionals that are, their job is to defend the internet border have done a pretty good job. The problem lies when you start getting into the corporate side. And then when you plug your laptop into the corporate side and act as if you're a corporate employee, at that point it's very simplistic to find the gateway into the SCADA system. A lot of the SCADA systems have common protocols, common ports open, common fingerprinting schemes that you can see that this is a data historian or this is an operational web server that's serving up real-time data from the plant. And you follow the trail and you'll find yourself down in the SCADA systems themselves. And what we find is that second layer of defense is typically very weak because there's a lot of holes opened up for communications between the SCADA systems and the corporate systems. And there's also requirements to send real-time data out to the local, the regional entities that have to manage load generation across the region. So this is what a typical generation system looks like. Next, let's talk about power transmission. So once the power is generated, there's also a requirement to do energy management and ensure that the energy that's being put out over the wires is managed properly. Now, these systems are a little bit different, and so not all SCADA systems are alike. So one point to take home is that, SCADA systems are almost like snowflakes. They're all different. Even if you look at one power transmission system and you go to look at another power transmission system, they're going to be different because they're designed specifically for that installation of that system. But typically what you'll find is the same type of an approach, an internet firewall, the corporate system, and then an EMS, energy management system, layer of firewalls protecting the energy management systems themselves. And in this middle layer, middle tier, before you actually get down into the substation controls, you'll find a lot of interesting things like outage management systems, GIS systems, which is basically allowing them to locate where all the different parts of their infrastructure are geo-spaced and located. And then you also see weather systems. The weather has a big impact on how you transmit energy over the transmission lines. So there's a lot of interconnectivity from outside sources that are based on the internet back into the control room environment. And so there's a lot of due diligence that needs to be done to ensure that those systems that need data from the internet are not also connected to the systems that get live feeds from the SCADA system. All right, so it's an important, getting the architecture right is the first part. And then if you push yourself down, there's typically a primary control system and backup control system. Both of these backup and primary systems are connected to all of the substations. Now, the very critical components are those that can actually remotely, from a click of a mouse, disconnect large chunks of load, right? And so this stuff is very important. That's why the NERC SIP regulations came about that said you need to define your perimeters around this stuff, know what's in those perimeters, know what ports and services are open, and harden those systems. And it is a wake-up call because a lot of these systems aren't hardened to the area where they need to be. And let's go to the next level. From transmission, then you get down into distribution of power down to the neighborhoods and large industrial customers. So again, a common type of field you'll get here is an internet connection point through the corporate layers down into the DMS systems, distribution management systems. Now, these systems are very similar to EMS systems. It's just that they're controlling a load distribution at a lower level. So instead of at like 100 kV and higher, which would be typically the transmission systems, distribution systems handles distribution at a smaller load at 67 kV or lower. The same concepts are there. They need to have connectivity to their outage management systems, trading systems, marketing systems, load shedding in case there's a problem with the amount of load on the grid. These systems have the ability to shed load. There's also connections to billing systems, because now that you're getting down into the distribution of power to homes and businesses, and now you need to actually start thinking about how do you track the usage of that electricity and bill off of it. And that's where the smart grid comes into place. AMR systems, automated metering reading systems, or AMI systems, is the next step. So the last 10, 20 years, we saw a progression of meter reading systems from where a guy walks out to your home periodically and reads it manually to the point where they had some low RF systems, so where they would send a truck into the neighborhood, and as the truck rolled through the neighborhood, it would collect the data off the meters, to the point to where now they want to even extend the automation to the point where the meters are always connected, always on, and being able to read data from the home or from the business 24/7. And I will talk about smart grid and smart metering systems at the end of the presentation about some of the vulnerabilities we've seen with those systems. But the key things to keep in mind is that distribution management systems do have the capability of shedding large chunks of load. And those systems can be interconnected back up through the internet. So making sure that these systems have the right security precautions in place is definitely the right thing to do. And as we walk through here, I'm going to then talk about the methodology we use to look at vulnerabilities, to discover vulnerabilities, and then I'm going to give you a whole set of statistics on what we've actually discovered over the past 9 years. The next question is, if these systems are all different, then how do we come up with common cybersecurity standards for SCADA? Especially when FERC and NERC manages the security rules and regulations around securing the power systems, but then you have DHS that manages the compliance regulations around chemicals and water and all the other critical sectors. So there's not really a common body that's looking at SCADA security across all the critical infrastructure sectors. What we found is that if you do a little bit of research, the NERC CIP standards, and you cross-reference those with the ISA S99 standard, which ISA is the International Society of Automation, you'll see that there's a common framework of security controls across the board. One of the things that ISA S99 laid out was this concept of security levels, starting at the things that are most important, the inputs and outputs and sensors and plant equipment controls. If you're down at that level, you can actually open valves, close valves, open disconnect switches, turn on power, turn off power. That's down at level 1. And as you work your way up through the infrastructure, you get all the way up to level 5. And as you transgress each of these levels, you have to have proper security controls in place. But at least now we have a model to start going by for how to look at security controls for critical infrastructure. So now let me kind of transition into the methodology that we've developed over the past 9 years, 9 or 10 years, is that you really can't just point, click, and run automated vulnerability scanners in this type of infrastructure. And I'll show you why. I have some screenshots of what some of the equipment has done when this stuff is done to it, especially when you put it on a bench and try to slam it with a lot of different tools. They have a tendency to reboot and do weird things, come back, try to reboot with an incorrect configuration. So the approach that we like to take is a very logical, layered approach, where you start with the physical security of these assets and work your way all the way down to the field devices that actually are doing the control of the system. And we like to use a defense in depth approach so that the physical security, the fencing, the video surveillance, that's protecting physical access to the systems. Then once you're on the wire, the network infrastructure, switches, routers, firewalls, those things should be protecting access to the next layer into the infrastructure. Those DMZ systems should be protecting access to the server at the server host layer. Server hardening, host hardening should have been applied to protect access to the applications. And then you actually peel back the application security to see that there's access to the communication stacks and protocols that are used to then talk to the end devices. So if you follow the wire and use a defense in depth approach, you can make sure that all the rocks are turned over when you're doing an assessment of these systems. And then if you look at a diagram that depicts this, physical security should then limit access to the digital assets. Then if you're following the line here, all of the network architecture, these things should be providing a defense in depth approach until you get down to the local controllers that control the system. So here's some quick thoughts, quick keys to keep in mind. If you're a security professional that has just been asked to be on a team that's going to look at some real-time systems that involve SCADA systems, or if you're a security professional working for a company that is in the critical infrastructure arena, know thy tools. That's the very first thing. If you're going to launch Nmap or launch whatever tools you want to use for vulnerability assessment work, make sure that you're going very slow. Make sure you test those tools on an offline system first. The worst thing you can do is just point, click, shoot with vulnerability scanning tools with the SCADA infrastructure. The key is to use a very passive approach. So it's okay to do pen testing from the internet on into the corporate systems, and we've actually been asked to penetrate from the corporate systems into SCADA. But once you start crossing that line into SCADA, all those pen testing concepts, pen testing tools need to be thrown out. And you need to kind of rethink how you do this. So instead of taking like a James Bond approach and just blasting in, you really need to take more like a sleuth approach and start kind of looking at the configs of these systems and passively capturing traffic and doing things that in a way that wouldn't harm the system. And if you can scan secondary systems or development systems that aren't in production, then that's game on, right? That gives you a lot more information if you can do an active scan. So doing these things, like I said, over the last 9 or 10 years, we've collected a lot of data. And the end of 2008 and early 2009, DHS wrote a contract with us to go through and mine through that data. We collected over 38,000 vulnerabilities in SCADA and critical infrastructure systems. And here's a couple of the results that came out of this research work that we did. First of all, we wanted to know where these vulnerabilities were discovered in this architecture model. Were they discovered at the controller layer with the valves and pumps and equipment? Or was it at the HMI, the console that the operators are using? Or was this vulnerabilities always on the corporate side? So the first thing we did was we were able to kind of sort our database and filter it based on different fields that we were capturing. And these are the types of things that we captured in our database. Each vulnerability got a unique ID, title, what security zone or location that vulnerability was found in the infrastructure. We also wanted to log when that vulnerability was disclosed in the public, and also the date when we discovered it, and that will come in handy when I go to the next slide, because we wanted to detect how many days this vulnerability had been in the wild and known and disclosed versus when we discovered it in the system. And then we also always have a remediation suggestion for the vulnerability. So we don't need no stinking O days, okay? There's a lot of people that are claiming, hey, we're researching SCADA O days, or we've got a boatload of SCADA O days. It's that's great, that's good, but you know what? You don't even need an O day, because what we found was that the average number of days between when a vulnerability is disclosed in the public and there's a known exploit for that vulnerability and when it's detected in a SCADA environment is about 330 days, or almost a year. So you can just roll into SCADA environments with all of your toolkits, Metasploit exploits that you have now, and you will have no problem breaking into SCADA systems, because you don't need an O day. A lot of these vulnerabilities that we discovered are already known vulnerabilities in the systems. And in fact, there was a few times when we discovered vulnerabilities that had been in the public for a long time. In fact, one was almost 7 years that had been sitting there, latent in the infrastructure. Now, you would ask, why is it taking so long for asset owners of these systems to discover the vulnerabilities, patch their systems, and clean up their mess? The problem is when you're running a SCADA system, there's no downtime. It's not like you can say, we're going to take a maintenance outage at 6 p.m. We're going to shut down the SCADA system that's controlling electric power distribution system, and we're going to patch it, because it has to run 24/7, right? So it's really difficult to patch these systems. A lot of times the vendors that source these systems into production have to vet the patch before it's done. So we've had many instances where our clients actually downloaded and installed a Microsoft patch or a Linux or Unix patch, and that patch actually broke the SCADA application. So it's very difficult for a SCADA asset owner or a SCADA engineer to maintain the systems in a secure way, because they have to make sure that the patch isn't going to break the system that they're managing. So next thing we wanted to find out was, well, where were the vulnerabilities most discovered in this model? And what we found was the largest number of vulnerabilities were detected at the DMZ layer between the corporate IT system and the SCADA systems. And here's some points about that. About almost half of the vulnerabilities we found was in that middle layer. And what we find is that that middle DMZ layer is kind of like no man's zone. It's like the corporate IT guys don't really want to take ownership of those systems, because many of those systems are SCADA components. So they don't really have the know-how to manage like a PI OSI data historian. They don't really know what it takes to manage that type of system. And then you have the SCADA engineers that are pushing data out to this middle layer, but then it's being consumed by corporate and enterprise users. And so they don't really think it's their job either. So they just say, well, you know, the IT guys are going to take care of that stuff over there. And so it's kind of like no one really takes ownership of that middle area of the infrastructure. So now we have this kind of perfect storm whereby this middle layer has the most vulnerabilities, yet it's the most connected to all of the critical infrastructure. Because once these middle layer components, database historians, web servers that are doing real-time displays of data, forwarding data to billing systems, trading systems, they have to be connected to everything in order for them to get the information. And they're trusted down into the SCADA environment. So once you're into that middle layer, you're pretty much home free in terms of what you can access. And you know, again, that SCADA DMZ network is the last line of defense before any traffic hits the SCADA network itself. And like I said here, you know, many cases these are trusted connections. So you can just ride on into whatever the connections are already made. So what we wanted to do was take apart the vulnerabilities at that middle layer and then pull the sheet back and say, okay, well, what types of vulnerabilities are here? And let's go to the next layer of analysis. So what we did here was we then looked at, it was about a little bit over 18,000 vulnerabilities. We ranked them by the type of exploit that can be used to exploit them. Actually, before I get there, we wanted to break down the vulnerabilities in the types of systems they were found on. And over half of them were web servers, business applications, and database servers, which we assumed that would be the case because that's the function that part of the network serves. You're logging data, so it's going to be a lot of database servers there. You're pushing data back out. You're displaying data. There's going to be a lot of web portals. Well, if I were to cover up, you know, the top part of this slide and just show you the bottom part of this slide and say that, oh, hey, we've got a lot of problems with web servers, a lot of problems with business applications, a lot of problems with database servers, you would say, hey, that just looks like the problems we're facing on the corporate side. So it's the same types of components that are used on the SCADA side as well. So SCADA, how can I own thee? Let me count the ways. So 18,000 vulnerabilities, all these types of exploits that can be used against them to gain access. So again, we did some analysis of that. And these types of exploits are already known. You know, configuration problems, patching problems, cross-site scripting, SQL injection. These are known attack vectors, right? And these are comprise the largest types of exploits that would work in the operational DMZ networks. So it's almost like we have this situation where we have a lot of vulnerabilities in a space that's connected to a lot of live critical infrastructure, and there's a lot of live exploits already written to take advantage of these things. So it's kind of like a ticking time bomb, and I just hope that the message that we're getting here can be you know, open a few eyes about the responsibilities that need to be taken to secure these systems down. So the next thing we wanted to find out was, okay, so what type of operating system are these SCADA systems running on that has all these vulnerabilities? And it's not a surprise to us. Over the past 10 years, a lot of the SCADA vendors have all ported their applications over to Microsoft. Back in the 90s, most of the SCADA systems that we worked with were Unix-based, and then they migrated their path up to Linux. But there was a big push in the 90s with Wonderware, Intellusion. A lot of these Windows-based software packages were easier to work with, easier to maintain. So the larger SCADA systems, such as like ABB and Yokogawa, all these systems, Televent on pipeline systems, all made the decision because their user base was screaming, hey, I want it on Windows. I know how to manage Windows, and I want a Windows solution for SCADA. So they just ported their applications over to Windows. Now the problem is you're doing the whole chasing the patch problem with Windows, having to go through upgrades every couple of years on the operating system, and it makes it harder, not easier, to secure your system when you're on a Microsoft system. And we're not here to poke holes at any one vendor, but I just thought it was funny because as you're walking around in life and you see kind of funny things, it's kind of interesting to take pictures of stuff. And so this was a marketing booth marketing Windows Vista, and they had a blue screen of death on it. So I thought that was kind of funny. Now, as you move down into the controller side, you start thinking, okay, well, what kind of vulnerabilities are in the embedded devices that actually are controlling the plant processes, the boiler control systems, the PLCs, the RTUs? Those aren't Microsoft. Those are typically like VxWorks or QNX, some type of really light operating system. And what we found was 65% of the vulnerabilities down in that controller network were due to QNX. And QNX is pretty much a large standard in which a lot of the embedded devices are built on top of. The next two pieces were vulnerabilities due to non-SCADA equipment. There's a lot of equipment that we have found on the SCADA system that were not used for SCADA functions, such as like video surveillance systems, VoIP systems, because they only have one connection point out to that remote facility, so they're running the SCADA protocols over the same channels that they're running their VoIP system, over the same channels that they're running their video surveillance system, so maybe card access systems that they're badging in and out of the plant with. So those types of systems were on the same logical network as the SCADA traffic as well. So it came up in our assessments. Now here's really interesting stuff. There's a whole bucket load of things that we found during our assessments over the past 9 years that we really couldn't classify. We just thought it was kind of interesting. So we put a couple slides up here. Things like adult video directory scripts and online dating service databases and gaming software servers. The most interesting thing that we found was a Counter-Strike gaming server that had been started and ran in the SCADA control room because a lot of these systems were engineered to be run in an automated fashion. I mean, basically it automatically takes action to make sure the system's in balance. So the operators get bored at night. So they're like, well, hey, let's bring in a game server into the control room. And then somebody had an idea, let's connect another network card to it and connect it to the internet so that we can get our buddies to play with us at night. And so now you have a direct feed from the internet into a Counter-Strike game server, which is then actually on the network that's running the plant. So that's just one example. So, I mean, basically when we go in to do an assessment, we know we're going to find this stuff because it's commonplace. It's like uncommon to actually find a hardened system whereby USB ports are disabled, media is disabled, the system is on its latest patch. It's kind of like, whoa, I would love to see a system like that, but we have not yet seen that yet. We have yet to find an actual IDS system running on a SCADA environment in all of our assessments we've done. Now, they might have an IDS sensor on the corporate side of the firewall as it gets into SCADA, but once you're actually on the SCADA network, very little IDS, very little logging at all. In fact, sometimes we're involved in incident response. They're like, hey, this worm just shut down our platform, an offshore platform. Okay, well, let's look at what happened. Let's recreate the timeline. Well, they didn't turn on event logging on the operating system level. They didn't turn on logging at the SCADA application level, so there is no logs. And that's commonplace. So anyway, I'll skip to the next screen. So more interesting things, but wait, there's more. Botnet code, remote command and control malware, Windows 95. We still find Windows 95 out there quite a bit. I mean, it's hanging on. It's like, yes, I can still run critical infrastructure 15 years after I was made. And It's still there. We find a lot of IM clients, things that would suggest that these systems are going outbound to the internet. So I'm going to try to wrap it up, make some summary points about the SCADA vulnerabilities, and then we'll jump into smart grid stuff, because that's pretty interesting too. The points we're trying to make here is that you don't really need a SCADA 0-day. They are starting to creep out into the public, and we're starting to become aware of them, but we don't even need them. There's a lot of vulnerabilities out there that already are in the infrastructure. And we're hoping that the asset owners of these systems will do a more diligent approach to perform assessments of these systems, root out their vulnerabilities, patch their systems more frequently, so that this time between when a vulnerability goes live and when it's discovered can be shortened down to hopefully like a month or so, you would hope. But it's almost at a year right now. Also, this DMZ network between the corporate environment and the SCADA environment is the one that's most prone to vulnerabilities, because it's kind of this no man's land, no one owns it, and then you have this scenario whereby it's also connected to everything. So that's another area we kind of want to shine a light on and say, someone needs to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, corporate IT security, you own it up until the SCADA firewall, or SCADA operations, you guys are going to have to manage these systems that are in the SCADA DMZ. And as we found that a lot of these vulnerabilities were run on Microsoft systems, that's where we are today. And we're hoping that we can take a more aggressive approach in managing the security of Windows systems, especially given the criticality of the types of applications and what those applications are doing. And again, down at the bottom, almost every assessment uncovered unnecessary software installed, whether that was on purpose or whether it was software installed by something else, or by a bot, or by an agent. So I'll ask the question again that we started with. You still think we're doing a good job? You guys still think we're good? We're Jake. We got a great critical infrastructure going here. I still think that there's a lot of work to be done. But wait, we have NERC CIP to save the day. We have regulations coming out that's going to force the power companies to install security and manage their systems. Well, NERC CIP isn't quite where it needs to be as well, and we're finding that a lot of power companies are wiggling around the definition of what is a cyber asset, what is a critical cyber asset, and they're trying to bend around the regulations to try to reduce their audit footprint. So, and again, oftentimes controls are often bypassed. Now this is really funny. This is another picture I took with my iPhone. This was actually the bathroom facilities at a restaurant that was on the docks where boats would come in and out. And this was actually a women's bathroom facility. So they showed the little shower, which you didn't see in the picture, was like the little women's sign above it. And so they said, okay, well, that we want to make sure that the ladies are secure, and the fact that they're going into this bathroom facility and they can take their showers. And so they put a little combo lock on it. And then I guess after so many times of asking for the code, they finally just pasted the code on top of the combo lock. So it defeats the purpose of even having it. So we find that all the time in the SCADA world as well. Someone installs a firewall and they think, oh great, I have a SCADA firewall. And then they do any-to-any connections. And they do like, well, anybody who wants Pi data can write on in it, port 5450. Come in and open up your process books, get real-time data. It doesn't matter, it's port 5450. It's not like a known vulnerability port, so go on in, And so we find it all the time. So are we collectively feeling better now? What we have found is that the NERC CIP standards at least forces the hand of the electric utilities to implement a common baseline set of controls, right? So it's been a good thing. I can tell you that we did a disclosure of the vulnerabilities to a panel of execs at a utility company back in 2003. And this was where their CIO, CFO was all present in the room, and we went through the vulnerability assessment report. And there was over 55 vulnerabilities. And the CFO turned to the CIO and said, what is the worst thing that could happen to me if we do not fix any of these vulnerabilities? And the CIO was like, well, we have a lot of exposure here. Someone could remotely manipulate and disconnect power. And she said, no. What is our financial risk? Like, what can we actually lose if we don't fix any of these? Are we going to be fined? Are we going to be sued? Are we going to have any types of fees from any regulatory agent? And this back in 2003, there was no NERC CIP. Governing security for the electric grid. And the CIO said, no, there's no financial risk. And so the CFO said, well, don't fix anything. You're not getting any budget. You can fix these based on the staff you have and based on the money you have, but you're not getting any money to fix these. So, and that was 2003. what we found today, 2010, is a much different tune, okay? Because NERC CIP has, with the NERC CIP regulations, FERC has the right to instill fines that are up to $1 million per day per occurrence. So those types of financial hit, if they are not found in non-compliance to these security standards, is a wake-up call. So now at least what we found is that the utility sector actually finally has budget and has money to be able to start doing things that they knew they should all along. And most of the NERC CIP standards are logical. They make sense. It's common sense, like have access controls at every digital perimeter going into SCADA. You should log every action done. These things are common sense. You would think people would be doing this already, but it took a government agency like FERC and the NERC Oversight Committee to actually force the utilities to do these things that you would think is common sense. So, but then at the end, even if everyone is playing fair, everyone is doing what they should with NERC CIP, everybody's in compliance, and if we're in a perfect world, all of a sudden, let's now insert some shiny new nifty smart grid gear. So now it's like, oh no, now we got to go back to the drawing board again, because now we just got to the point where we can say that SCADA can be secured. We have a common framework to how to secure SCADA. Now we throw this new animal in the mix, the smart grid, that doesn't have common security standards and proprietary protocols and all of the same things that we dealt with SCADA. So now here's a couple thoughts about smart grid technology. What we found is that automated metering infrastructure, automated reading systems have similar vulnerabilities to SCADA systems. So, history is going to repeat itself. The assessments that we're doing on smart grid technology are turning out the same results of the assessments we do on SCADA technology. The same old threats, but now we have different impacts of those threats. So as you look at this, we have the same problem, a perimeter issue. We're remotely collecting all of this information on what power is being consumed, and we're having to push it out and share it with all these different entities. Well, where is the perimeter? How do we harden this system? That's been a big issue with the systems that we looked at. When you actually look at the back-end server applications that are actually collecting all of the data, the consumption data from the homes and businesses, those web applications, database applications, were ported over from older applications that were written in C. They were not even using more modern frameworks for coding practices. And it's like the smart grid companies are taking packages that they know work, and they're porting it over as fast as they can to work with their technology, but they're not actually changing the internal code of the systems. They're not building these systems from scratch. And then if you peel across the next layer, there's too much trust in the protocol. A lot of times the vendors will say, hey, we use Zigbee. And so we have 128-bit encryption, and we follow the Zigbee Alliance, so you should trust us. We're good. And when you start peeling back the layer, and there's going to be other talks about smart meters and the problems in smart meters throughout today and tomorrow, you'll find is you can't just put all your trust in the protocol, because even the Zigbee protocol itself has problems in the way it does encryption. So it's kind of like we're going to go over the same problems and repeat history again. And again, the end devices themselves, the meter devices themselves have the same problems as PLCs and RTUs. If you scan them too fast, they reboot. If you send them malformed packets, they tend to crash. Okay, so now we got the same problem as a SCADA system. We have end devices that have vulnerable stacks. We have protocols that aren't really secure the way they need to be. We have back-end servers and applications that were older frameworks that have been kind of dusted off and resold into the smart grid field. And then we have weak perimeters. So we're kind of like going to go back to the same problem again we have with SCADA. So that's why I talk about deja vu. Now, a lot of times these systems are being rolled out to operate for 20 years without requiring a system upgrade. And that's kind of a fallacy. I mean, I don't think you can ever roll out something nowadays for 20 years and not require it to be updated. So you combine that with the patching and firmware problems, and you get a situation where now you can remotely upgrade the firmware over the air to thousands of devices. Now that's a really sticky situation. Here's some quotes by other security professionals. These guys are both here at the conference, and so they allowed me to put these quotes here, but all it would take is to actually start a firmware download and stop it, or download the wrong firmware, or patch them in a wrong way. And all of a sudden you've got thousands of devices that reboot in an unconfigured manner. So now you have to roll a truck out to 50,000 homes with a serial cable, connect it to the back of the meter, re-flash it, reprogram it to get it to come back up, right? We've actually experienced that. I have some screenshots of what, and actually some code that we used to crash the meters. And it's just a basic ping command. So we have old threats, new impacts. We can read data off these smart grid systems. So data enumeration. What about being able to read if your power consumption, the thing I'm worried about is I don't want anyone else to know what my power usage is, because everybody has their own unique load profiles. When you wake up in the morning, you turn on certain appliances are used throughout the day, you go to work, you come back home, you do other things, right? It builds a signature. If you're actually reading and capturing traffic off these power meters, you can actually determine a load profile. Now, what happens when you go on vacation? I know what I do. I turn off my AC. I live in Houston, Texas. I don't want to have a big, huge power bill. So I turn off my AC, I turn off all my lights, I lock my doors, and I walk out. So if someone was monitoring my power usage, they could know immediately when I went on vacation, and they can target me. They could actually break into my home and know I'm not there, right? So what happens if you were able to read an entire neighborhood and then look at analysis and algorithm that says, okay, when the load profiles change to this, now give me the address and location of all these smart meters, and then throw that on top of a Google Maps. Now it's kind of like, it's like a home invasion's best dream, to actually know exactly when people are going on vacation based on the amount of power they use. So I think data enumeration and privacy is pretty important. Being able to know what systems are connected to this network is pretty important. Knowing what services are exposed, if these embedded smart meters have embedded web pages or offer FTP or Telnet types of services, that's kind of important. Being able to change the data on the fly, steal accounts and passwords, we've done all these things. Capturing traffic. This is the same old stuff you saw before, okay? This is not anything new. Man-in-the-middle attacks still work with smart grid data. And actually changing data on the fly. Just simply moving the decimal point over so that, the last 24 hours, instead of using 250 kilowatts, I use 25 kilowatts, right? Starting to reduce your power. This is where it gets into the concept of electricity for free, right? So how many of you guys have modded your Xbox? How many of you guys jailbroke your iPhone? Don't worry, I'm not taking pictures of the audience. I think the next step is going to be modding your electric meter. I mean, if someone came up with a way to mod the electric meter to run foreign code on it and make it reboot, and then allow you to tweak all the little sensitivities and the way it monitors the energy, you can slowly scoot back the ratios, so that to the point where you can actually be using electricity at like a third of the monitored rate, right? So these are things to keep in mind. But sometimes it's not even that hard. I mean, this is basically an administrator writing the clear, not even encrypted. Bricking systems aren't really that hard, to where if you slam with different types of traffic, it comes back with bad system configuration, and you can't even ping it anymore. You have to use a serial cable to then reconfigure it. And just a simple ping attack. Okay, we were just basically pinging these devices and ramping up the byte size of the payload to the point where it just crashed. It rebooted, and then when it came back, it wouldn't actually talk to us anymore. We actually had to hook up a serial cable to it, reprogram it again, and then it came back up with an IP address, and I can communicate it again. Okay, so this is just basic ping commands. What about denial of access? Some of these devices have embedded passwords in them that you can actually change over the wire by actually sending out a command and changing the password. So we wrote a little piece of code and used Metasploit to basically first detect if that device used the password change part of the protocol, and then we sent the next swing out to all of the controllers and changed the passwords. Now, the thing that was interesting is that the password protected application is automatically downloaded on each switching on-off cycle. It cannot be undone if you forget the password. You have to send the device off for repair. Okay, so imagine doing this thousands of times, and then all those devices have to be sent back to the factory because there's no backup password. And so if you don't know the password, you have to send it back to the factory, right? So are you thirsty for more? The thing we want to talk about is SCADA security training. So what we found is that it's missing. We have a lot of SCADA guys that work in plants and control these things, but they don't know a lot about cybersecurity. And we have a lot of IT professionals that know cybersecurity, but don't really know a lot about SCADA. So we developed a 5-day training course whereby you build a SCADA system yourself. You build the little controls, you turn on things on and off. And the last 3 days of the class, you actually tear it apart, beat it up, and learn how to penetrate into them. So if you want more, there's more information about how to get training specifically on SCADA security. So here's the last few comments, and we'll start taking some questions, some answers, question and answer time, is that the power generation, transmission, and distribution systems all require these systems to be up 24/7. So it's difficult to patch. Okay? In the past, these systems used serial protocols, special cables, and that stuff wasn't really that big of a deal. But now we have this convergence where a lot of this critical infrastructure is running on enterprise systems. Juniper, Cisco, Microsoft. Now it's looking like a corporate system. In fact, some of these SCADA systems, when we scan it with a vulnerability scanner, it looks just like a scan that came back from a corporate system. So now that it's starting to look and feel like a corporate system, the problem is we don't have the same security features we take for granted on the security side, on the corporate side. When you go to work every day, you know that you're going to have to change your password every 30 days. You know that you're going to have antivirus on your machine. You know that there's probably going to be IDS. There's probably going to be logs monitoring what you do. You have acceptable use policies you sign on what you can and cannot do on your machine. There's a whole host of security controls that we all take for granted on your machines that you use for your email and your work. On the SCADA side, those machines look and feel the same way. They're Windows machines. They're running applications. They're doing the same stuff. But they don't have antivirus, they don't have IDS, they don't have the ability, they're not turning on the logging, and so they don't have all of the same type of controls that the corporate side has. And what we found is that the NERC CIP security compliance regulations is making a small dent into the problem, but certainly not enough to hold back a determined attacker. We're starting to see advanced persistent threats creep into SCADA infrastructure, whereby some of the SCADA systems owners and operators, they don't think they're actually in control of their own system anymore. So someone has been in our system long enough that when we go to re-image the system, the image has already been owned. So we don't even know how deep this infiltration has gotten. And we're there today already. So the research that we and other independent security firms have performed on this infrastructure has led to a situation where electricity can be free. I mean, the concept of the title was to just trigger your mind and to open your mind into thinking, those who have intent and motivation can do this type of stuff. It's not where we have to have a proof of concept anymore. It's already been proven. So there's information if you guys want to ask any questions later. Always respond to emails. It may not be the exact same day, but we do respond to any questions you guys might have. And with that, I'll open up to any questions from the audience. Sure. Yes. Yes. The question that he asked was a lot of the smart metering systems are leveraging the cellular data packet systems, right? And was the second part of your question was? And the base station, yeah. Can you sniff the traffic going from the meter back to the provider if it's using a cellular system? Well, thing is, you're going to see other presentations done today and tomorrow that talks about man-in-the-middle attacks on cellular data packets. So just because you're using like a Verizon or AT&T system to transfer data, it's quasi-private. You're getting a private IP address within their system, but it's certainly, you can't just put all your faith in their system. It's certainly a little bit more secure than traditional RF systems like 900 megahertz with basic encryption on it or Zigbee, but you still have to worry about if that can be hijacked in the middle. Yes, yes. The question was, if an attacker had physical access to an RTU or a PLC, can they go back through that channel backwards to the control room? Absolutely, Absolutely. In fact, sometimes we're hired to do a red team attack, whereby the company says, I don't care how you get into our control room, we want you to break into our control room. And the best way to do it is not attack the control room head on, because they have fences and guards and gates and cameras. Go to a remote substation or to a remote microwave tower, some remote part of the facility, that infrastructure, and break in there, because you're on the wire at that point. If you're at where an RTU is and it's a TCP/IP connection, you can ride that connection back to the control room very simply. What was that again? Which, like BGP you're talking about for? Oh, oh. For redundancy, yes. What we found is that the SCADA environment typically lags corporate IT by about 5 to 10 years. And so, whereas now, VMware virtualization is commonplace for corporate IT infrastructures, virtualization is just starting to be embraced by SCADA, because it's a trust factor. It's like, before I had this big pig iron machine and it's running my SCADA system, and if there's a problem, I have another machine sitting here I can turn on. And so it's this whole thing of trusting this virtualized system to virtually run my operating system and applications. And also, the SCADA applications have to be tuned to work actually in a virtualized operating system. We're starting to see that, actually. Some of the smaller SCADA systems that run like water plants, gas compressor systems, and those Windows applications such as like Wonderware, Intellusion, SciTech, those systems have embraced virtualization. Some of the larger vendors like ABB and such are just now starting to think about it. They don't actually have a full-blown virtualization, a virtualized SCADA environment yet. So I suspect over the next 3 or 4 years, it will be the same, it'll follow the same cycle as the corporate IT side. Other comment? Yes, so the question was, have we seen any SCADA-specific firewalls that do deep inspection of the protocols? So we are seeing companies leverage multi-layer UTM devices, such as like Cisco ASA or Fortinet, different devices that have the ability to take apart the packet and inspect it. However, and there has been some work in actually doing SCADA protocol analysis work and plugins. There's a company called Digital Bond that was hired, actually worked for the US government about 3 or 4 years ago, that wrote signatures for Modbus, I think for DNP3, and a couple of the other SCADA protocols. And most of the corporate security vendors have taken those SCADA plugins and put it into their firewalls. So you can use deep inspection firewalls and then put the SCADA-specific signatures into there. In fact, there's also a lot of people that we've worked with that have actually taken classes on developing custom NID signatures and then have written their own signatures for certain events. Now, there's also a company called, there's a firewall device called the Tofino firewall that was actually written for SCADA systems, and it does actually inspect the Modbus protocol itself. So in the Modbus protocol, there's 16 function codes to read and write registers, read and write coils, within a SCADA system, and they have the ability through a GUI to where you can set up which coils and which registers you want to deny the ability to read and write from. And the firewall will then actually go deep into the Modbus protocol, and if you're requesting to read or write data to a specific register in the PLC, the firewall has the smarts to actually stop the packet. And that's the first one we've seen. There may be others out there. Yes? One-way data diodes? Yes, we have. The only industry we've seen that in is in the nuclear industry. They have the nuclear industry has very strict controls around what data can move forward and back. And from the control system out, it can only go outbound. So we see in the nuclear field one-way diodes as well as air gaps, but we have not seen any of that use of technology in any other sector. That's right, exactly. Oh yeah. In fact, I think in 2005 we wrote a white paper, and it was 6 ways to protect the perimeter. And we put that, one-way diode, push a secure file onto a server and let someone else pick it up. We even went down to the road of actually building a prototype for a system that only transferred data serially. So the data was collected from the SCADA system, and then there was a serial RS-232 cable from that device to another server, and it pushed it over a serial connection. So you can't even hack backwards. It won't propagate through because it's a non-routable protocol. So we produced that as a kind of a proof of concept as well. And we haven't had any companies come back and say, hey, that's interesting or anything, you know. Yes. Yes, exactly. Anyone else? Questions? Yeah, the waste and AWWA is kind of been taking on that as kind of the body that looks over waste water and wastewater, and they're looking at the CFAT standards for chemicals, which was developed by DHS, and they're starting to take that on and embrace that for the water industry. And if you look at the CFAT standards, there's 19 components of it, and only one, which is Section 8, deals with cybersecurity. So they're really much more concerned about someone dumping something in the water or someone stealing chemicals to make weapons out of it. So DHS, if you look at the DHS standards and you look at the NERC CIP, the DHS standards are mostly physical and one little piece about cyber. It says you must always be in control of your control systems, and if you had an attack, you have to prove that you were in control. So basically it's very vague. It means basically you need to do enough due diligence to put in controls in place to know who did what. But if you look at the NERC CIP, it's 002 through 009 is all these standards are all cyber and then one physical. So the electric grid is much more concerned about a cyber attack than a physical attack. So it does vary by vertical. Anyone else? I think that we'll wrap it up. You guys go. Thanks a lot.